Hello and welcome to episode 82 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm Dalton.
Welcome back, chaps. Chris, you recently were talking to a friend about their work situation and being forced to use software that they weren't that happy about.
Yeah, this is it. One of my friends in his workplace, up until now, has had unfettered IMAP access to his work email. So he's been using Thunderbird. And suddenly he went to open it and it said, this app is not allowed. You know how it uses OAuth 2, I think, or something similar? It basically said, you've been deauthorized, visit this link. And so he visited the link and it brought up the place he works for. And it said, you are not allowed to use this app until you justify why you get to use it. So there's like a free text box that said, please give your reasoning for why you should be allowed to use Thunderbird.
Did you write, I care about software freedom?
He wrote something a bit stronger than that. And it got us started into a conversation, basically. I'm very much of the opinion, if that happens and you fill in the box in good faith and they say no, I'm not going to down tools or quit my job over it. I'm just going to do what they want me to do because I want the least friction possible. Whereas my friend was of the opinion, no, I'm not doing this. They'll have to force me to stop using it. And he got me thinking about pragmatism and whether you just go with the flow or you stand up for it, because I just want a quiet life. I want to be able to access the emails that let me do my job in whichever way my workplace has decided I should. But maybe I'm a bit too soft and maybe I should be raising a clenched fist and standing up for the ideals of free and open source software.
I don't know. I think I'm probably in a similar camp to you, Chris, in as much as it's not my email, so I don't care. Like, it's not like my personal life is going through whatever proprietary mail client they ask me to use. And at the end of the day, no matter what mail client they do or don't want me to use, I still get paid at the end of the month. Hopefully. Unless I put something horrible in that box, then maybe not.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because the more you follow what is wanted to be done, in this case, they want my friend to use Office 365 and that whole single pane of glass because they pay per employee for a seat and everything integrates in the same way. It has to be Teams because all the calendar entries are organized through that. And yeah, if you swim against that tide, you're using ICS files and calendar sync and trying to avoid that. For me, it just makes life too difficult. And then people will start questioning you. Have you done this work? What work? Oh, did you not get it? No, because my Thunderbird's broken. Oh, right. So you haven't done that then. Oh, I'm not very happy with you because you haven't done that.
There certainly is an element of being able to blame someone else for your problems if you use IT's recommended tools.
Yeah, when Office 365 goes down, then you just basically watch YouTube all day. It's not my problem. There's nothing I can do to fix it. Whereas if you are using your own solution like Thunderbird or whatever it is, Clause Mail, then you don't know, did I break something? Is it my end?
We continue down the same line. And obviously the thoughts you have is that your workplace will then turn around and mandate tighter and tighter managed controls. I'm lucky that I get to work on the Linux desktop, which would be my preference. But if my work turned around to me and said, no more Linux desktop, you have to use Windows, I would not be happy about that. But I would probably just bite the bullet and get on with it and try, I'd be setting up guacamole servers to get reverse remote desktops. I would get my Linux somehow, but it's my job. And if the tools get mandated, I'll be unhappy about it. And if it gets too bad, yeah, you might start looking elsewhere. But in the immediate, I'm not going to go, right, I'm just not working until you let me have my preferred stack.
There are some engineers for who that works, though. People who, are really deep into kernel code on an embedded project, for example. I don't know how I would know that, but they definitely get the Linux that they want, even if IT isn't happy about it. So it certainly is a thing that can be done if you are important enough to the company.
But Chris, you're just not important enough, are you, ultimately?
Well, I don't know about that, Joe. I think conversations like that might happen from time to time, and you're always able to present what difficulties that creates for you. And for us, we administer Linux systems as well. So we're not just developing. There's certain workflows that become a lot more difficult and we just throw questions back. So they say, okay, we want to move this workflow in this direction. And you say, okay, how do I do this, and this? Silence, and they go away.
But what about if they forced you to use a Windows machine and you weren't allowed to have WSL or remote desktop? They somehow managed to lock all that down and you're just literally using Windows with Windows Terminal and or PowerShell.
Here's an interesting thing, right? So another friend of mine, in their job, they mandated secure mobile devices and laptops, and they paid a huge amount of money to a consultancy firm, and they put it so locked down that people were just using their own devices. They were taking pictures. They were sending it on personal WhatsApp, and just it completely backfired because everyone was like, "This is I feel too strictured. I'm just gonna completely just not use anything they've asked me to do." So as you asked me that, Joe, that's what I feel like I would do. I would have a secret second laptop on the side and probably put myself in a vulnerable position in terms of employment and hope that they don't find out that I'm just not doing it the way that they want me to.
Yes, rebellions against IT tend to start silently.
Well, this is the thing, right? By enforcing too stricter controls, you end up creating these shadow IT things where someone's gone and set up a web server on the side or is using their own laptop. But equally, you kind of do understand why some of those restrictions are put in place in some cases. I don't know, maybe I'm just a bit too seasoned from having had users turn up with their MacBook and said, "This is the machine I'm using," and then having had to block it from the network and things in the past.
You're just a corporate shill, Gary. That's your problem.
Yeah, that's definitely me.
I mean, I was certainly in between. You know, if someone showed up and said, "Hey, this is the tool that I really, really would like to do my job," and like the team all wants to start this, it's like, okay, we'll give it a try. Unless it was, you know, a very obvious security breach waiting to happen. Especially if people were nice about it, then it was a little easier to bend the rules. But I was in much smaller shops than I think that either of you were.
Yeah, I think that it depends on how the person asks and what their justification is, right? If someone just turns up with their bring your own device thing and just starts using it, that's one thing. But if someone turns up and says, "Look, I would be way more productive here if you gave me a Windows box or a Mac or a Linux box or whatever it is," and they can provide justification as to why, like I think in your case, Chris, it's pretty obvious that your team administering large-scale Linux boxes are going to be more productive using Linux on the workstation, then I think if we could find a way to manage and control those machines to keep those people productive, then that would be fine.
Well, the last time I had a proper job, they tried to force antivirus on us. And I'm like, I use Linux. I'm not installing some weird proprietary antivirus. Like, no. And it got kind of closer and closer to the point where I was going to have to do it. And I kept kind of fobbing them off. And then, thankfully, they fired me. So that fixed that problem.
Completely unrelated reason, I'm sure.
It was actually in the end.
I have had a friend who was mandated to take an exam on a Windows machine. It went so far that they just were like, "I'm not doing this," because they had to use Windows, but also they had to install a piece of software that had full access and then locked everything down for the duration of the exam, and then give the remote exam proctor a full guided tour of their house on the webcam so that they weren't cheating. And also they had to sit in a prescribed room that only had one door that was always on camera. Otherwise they were worried someone would come in with notes in a second door or something. And then it's just, then it becomes, it's not just the operating system. It's the whole, like, you're vetting my house?
Yeah, I've had that before where those exam proctors have been like, "How dare you have power connected to your monitor? You must show me that you've disconnected the IEC lead from your monitor." It all feels a bit much to me.
How are you supposed to do the exam with no monitor?
Well, you have to use a laptop. Like, they will not let you use a desktop machine.
Oh.
So if you don't have a laptop and it's not running Windows, then no exam for you, I guess.
You know, it's interesting you talking about people arriving with something that might be insecure. I distinctly remember a few years ago when I started my current role, I was still running Ubuntu Mate, and I had the Flatpak issue where the title bar of every Flatpak I ran had "as super user" in it.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It looked like all my desktop applications I was running as root, which would be like the ultimate noob thing that I'd logged into my desktop session as root. And it turned out it's to do with the process ID and namespaces and fire jail Flatpak. So the desktop environment, some of them, especially Mate and Marco, were reporting that it was running in root's namespace, which was not true at all. It was a complete misreporting. But the Flatpak developers and the Mate desktop developers got into a bit of a to and fro about whose fault it was, so it didn't get fixed for ages. I switched to XFCE, so I don't know. But yeah, that was a bit awkward because I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I was brand new in the job and it looked like I was running everything as root.
Did you have to screen share anything, any of those applications?
I was sending screenshots and yeah, a few eyebrows get raised when, are you running Telegram as root? No, I've installed the Flatpak.
Chris, you noob, you're fired.
That's like when I first got into modding Windows and I got this tiny XP ISO and all there was the administrator account. And so when I went in IRC and stuff, it would just show me as administrator and people were like, oh, you can't be administrator. I'm like, what does that mean? That was also when I had a cable modem plugged in via USB. So I don't think I even had any sort of NAT or anything.
Those were the days.
It is a wonder my computer didn't literally explode. Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxafterdark.net/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at linuxafterdark.net/support. All right, what about the elephant in the room here? And that is that two of you don't even use Linux on the desktop.
Huh? Who? Me?
No idea what you're talking about.
I think that, Gary, you've got more of an excuse because at least you're using a really sweet Mac, whereas using Windows, ugh.
My question about this is, me and Joe know this filthy secret that we harbour every recording, but do you have a choice for what you use and you're making this choice? I think that's the case, right? You could run the Linux desktop and you choose not to. Is that fair?
Yes, I could use the Linux desktop, and for your information, on laptops and tablets and a lot of things, I do use Linux. Just not the one that we're using to record right now because Surface doesn't like Linux, even with the kernel. Oh well.
And that's one without a fan, and that's why I use it for this.
Exactly.
That's fair.
What about Surface Linux that we talked about on Late Night Linux recently?
I've tried installing it. The performance is just really weirdly bad under Ubuntu, and that's kind of unacceptable for our recordings. I have no idea how Windows performs better on this device. It just does.
Because Microsoft made it.
Made by Microsoft, isn't it? What do you expect? You know, the Surface Linux folks have done a great job, but how can you compete with a behemoth like Microsoft?
Pretty easily because they tend to be kind of lacking in the people talking to each other department.
Well, I couldn't use the Linux desktop if I wanted to, because I have a bunch of proprietary applications which do not work on the Linux desktop. And as far as I know, there are no viable alternatives on the Linux desktop for those applications.
Is this for in a work context?
So I have two Macs. I have the work Mac and I have the personal Mac, both of which end up with applications on that I just cannot run on the Linux desktop, or there are no viable alternatives to on the Linux desktop that I'm willing to use.
A question for both of you, I guess, is do you feel frustrated that you can't use the Linux desktop and you'd prefer to be there and these are blockers? Are you actually sort of happy? He says with surprise.
Are you happy being a bad person? Yeah.
Holy shit.
I felt frustrated for a long time that I couldn't use the Linux desktop. And I think in the last year or two, I've come to a point of acceptance that in order to do the things I do, both professionally and personally, I have to use a Mac. There is software that just will never exist on Linux for stuff I do personally. For example, there are a lot of creative applications that there are no alternatives to on Linux. So I'm thinking really obscure stuff like the Allen and Heath GLD editor or Behringer XAir control or ProPresenter and various applications like this that I use multiple times a week, every week, that I just cannot get on a Linux box. And sure, I could carry a Linux box with me and do my day-to-day computing on that. But equally, I'd then have to carry 2 laptops. And actually, the apps that I want to use on Linux, like Inkscape or OpenShot, are available on the Mac, and I just do that.
Yeah, and it helps that the Mac hardware is really, really nice. And you've got is it an M3 15-inch MacBook Air, which I saw recently.
Yeah, that's the one I've got. And it is a really nice laptop. And for example, the weekend of OggCamp, I did not plug the laptop in from Friday night to Sunday morning. And I was presenting and recording panel talks and running sound and all sorts of other stuff.
Oh, the dream.
And that was incredibly nice. But the flip side is that I am probably less productive on the Mac than I would be on, say, my ThinkPad. It's just that there are these things that I need to do that I can only do on the Mac. So, yeah, I'm that person at the Linux conference who is standing at the front doing the welcome talk from Google Slides on a MacBook. I'm sorry.
But you represent the reality of a typical Linux user.
Mm-hmm.
I've said this so many times before. You, Gary, use Linux quite a lot on all of the stuff running your home lab, some stuff at work that's not abstracted away. You are a typical Linux user because you don't use it on the desktop. It is pretty abnormal as a Linux user to use it on the desktop as far as I'm concerned. Not if you listen to shows like this, but if you are a normal person out there just getting on with life, you are definitely not out of the ordinary.
Well, running on the network that I'm connected to right now, there are at least 7 or 8 Linux boxes doing various bits and pieces. And yeah, at work, there are certain tasks I do SSH'd into a desktop machine somewhere that is running Red Hat.
I think nothing illustrates that point, Joe, more than when me and my wife had dinner with some people we met in the area, and it was a translator who was married to a developer. So we sat down for dinner and we were talking, and the developer said, "What do you do, Chris, for a living?" And I explained. Then his wife, who was the translator, said, "Oh, this Linux thing sounds really cool. Maybe I should run it." And he turned to her and tapped her on the arm and said, "Oh, no, you don't want to do that. It's a waste of time." To which my wife said, "Oh, I run it. I've been running it for like years." And then we had a conversation, but you've got Chris there the whole time. And he absolutely uses Linux all day long, but he's doing VS Code dev containers, WSL. He's running either Windows or Macs. He is not running the Linux desktop to do that. But as you say, Joe, he is definitely a Linux user.
And to be clear, I don't advocate anyone use their computer in the way that I do, where most of the stuff I do isn't actually on my computer at all.
It's funny that my wife uses Linux on her laptop, and that's all she's got on there is Ubuntu, obviously. And one time she says to me, "Oh, my laptop's not working." I'm like, "What? Let me have a look at it." Booted it up, and it just booted to like a TTY. I'm like, "What? Start X not found. What's going on?" But it turns out that the alias that I use, up equals like sudo apt-get update and blah, 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 including auto remove, somehow had auto removed the XFCE desktop completely.
Ooh.
So needless to say, I took that out of her script, and it was just as easy as installing the Ubuntu desktop again. It took about 5 minutes.
I'm certainly the Linux system administrator for my parents as well. I think that Linux on the desktop is really, really good as long as you have a system administrator or are the system administrator or willing to learn that kind of thing. So that absolutely works.
I think at this point, what I'd like to say as well, though, is I'm going to get my oil can out of my toolkit and oil this creaky gate that obviously people are going to try and erect and smash it all to bits, because I hate it when this conversation comes up and you're gatekeeping, blah, blah, blah. It's really important to say that both approaches are very, very valid. It's absolutely feasible to run Linux on the desktop, and nobody here is criticizing people that do. It's equally viable to say it's absolutely viable to run Windows or macOS and then run Linux tools. Computers are just tools. And that comes back to where we started this conversation. For me, whether I'm using Outlook, Office 365 because my work mandates it, or Thunderbird, a computer is a tool to let me get things done, and I'm going to choose the path of least resistance to get there. And I don't think it's bad either way. And it's really what fits, what you need to do to get that done. And the main thing is that you don't get hung up on that.
Yeah, and the main thing is that you don't criticize other people for their choices. It's up to you. If you two don't want to run Linux on the desktop for your various reasons, then you're missing out, and I'll tell you that, but it's not up to me to tell you you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, and equally, we can't sit here and say, right, well, that's it then. You're fired. We've had enough. We don't want to hear your opinions anymore. You don't know what you're talking about. Clearly.
All right, later, losers.
An absolute crock, right? Because I think it's a flip of that. You know, me and Joe run Linux on the desktop, but if you come to the four of us and say, right, we need an expert opinion, I'm going to point my finger at you two first.
Yeah.
So it has no bearing on experience, knowledge, ability, any of that stuff. It's not a value judgment. It's just a difference of opinion and preference.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Do let us know what you think about all of this. show@linuxafterdark.net. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
And I've been Dalton.
See you later.